way you want. Again, the remaining part of the talk, we'll look at what ColdFusion looks underneath, and I think we have about 10 minutes left.
So as we talked about earlier, right now, as of ColdFusion 6 or MX, ColdFusion is now Java-based. Everything is compiled to every page, every component is compiled to Java classes, and then run inside the context of servlets. Now, ColdFusion lets you compile, you can precompile pages in addition to having them run at runtime. Most of the time, you don't need to do this because they still want to make it easy to use, and so you can still deploy your site live with the plain source CFM and CSV files, and have those be editable, and changes get detected and recompiled on the fly. You can precompile if you'd like to speed things up a little bit. And so for each class, for each file, it generates one class per page or component, and then in addition, any functions, any UDFs defined in that page or function also get their own classes. And ColdFusion comes with a utility called CFCompile, which does the precompilation if you want. So if you have more than one class that gets generated for a given file, it doesn't generate multiple files. It generates one. It concatenates all the related Java classes related to a given source file, and it puts them into one concatenated file, and the file name is identical to the source file. I suppose it made sense to somebody, but that's not necessarily easily analyzed. You kind of have to separate them. And also, you can take those files and then bundle them up as an EAR or WAR file and shove them into your application server of choice. So as I mentioned, they use a fairly non-standard format for bundling up classes instead of using a jar or multiple files. So we wrote a quick utility to undo this, and it says as of now, but I haven't gotten around to adding that yet. But I promise to have it up by the end of the night. And it's a free open source Java utility that unpacks all of these compiled files. So if you run across files that have been precompiled with the cfcompile.bat or .sh, you can use this tool to go through and generate individual files, which then you can load into either Pro or anything you'd like, or JAD or J2EE, and use that. So the way these work is, the way these classes work in ColdFusion is that generally there's one function that is the entry point. For pages and components, that method is called runPage. For UDF method, it's named runFunction. And occasionally when I say they, I mean the compiler factors out certain blocks of code, of generated code, and creates separate methods that are then called by these given methods. And additionally, there are other methods inside of a class and part of the interface that get called as set various data and retrieve and accessor methods for various things. So because you can use, because the variable names are accessible dynamically in a way that's not really possible in Java outside of reflection, the generated Java is actually kind of ugly sometimes. When it comes to variables, you can see we have a simple piece of code over here that just sets a variable named vfoo to value 1. And there's a similar assignment using, well, if it's not assigned already, as Chris mentioned, pbar will be assigned to value 2. And then those values are printed out. This is what it looks like with a lot of setup stuff omitted where the comment lines are. This is what it looks like. In some cases, it generates actual properties of the generated Java class. In this case, vfoo and pbar. And it assigns those. Those represent not the actual variables themselves, but they represent bindings to the current scope of the variable, either the local scope or the scope of the calling page, which is also accessible, for other scopes as well. And because they represent bindings, you can bindings in the table, you can use these accessor objects to set values, and that's what it looks like from when you have very simple static assignments like this. Thought I had a slide that said it, but so when there are static references like this, but that's not the only case. As I mentioned earlier, you can specify the name of a variable to set dynamically, and so I think I have a slide later that shows that. And so here's in this this is the kind of the setup to how those get bound. Those variable scope and local scope objects are basically tables. They represent all of the variables in a given scope and and here's the setup for method that binds them. Here we are. Now here's the dynamic references. There you can access variables in scopes not only through the bound and generated object methods, but you can also do it through a whole host of methods, and there's a bigger list in the paper, a whole host of methods that basically use dynamic strings as names of variables to read and write. So in this case, you have, So there are other ways to set variables other than cfset, cfparam. gfquery, we mentioned earlier, results in variables being imported into the local scope. Structures, which are structures can act in similar to scopes in that they have properties, and you can set variables to them. That's also true of components as well. Components have their own object associated with them, and other various utilities or other various utility tags. And as I mentioned earlier, you can bundle these applications up as a WAR file, and they're handled by various servlets. The structure is actually quite complicated. They're definitely not just raw JSP pages or raw servlets. There's one servlet that handles all of a given set of CFMs and all of a given set of CFCs. And that sets up all the data for the function, results in the application.cfm being invoked or CFC being invoked if they exist. And included in the WAR is, in addition to these servlets, is the administrator thing. And this is the administrator is a console that administrators can use to set up things like data sources and various request parameters, some of the filtering options. A lot of that is accessible through this web app. And you can optionally include it in the WAR file. It gives you the option. And even if you don't, if you check no, a lot of that is still there, and that's still mapped in the default WAR. So be on the lookout for that. If you are overseeing people who are deploying using this, you might want to, after these WARs get generated, you might want to unpack it and take out some of the things that aren't in use if you're not going to use this administrator. One interesting thing about this is that the administrator has password protection, but there is no way to reset the password or retrieve it from files. So if you lose the password, the way Adobe tells you to get it back is to go into the XML file, neosecurity.xml, and just turn off authentication altogether. That's great, except if you forget to do that, then it just stays off. And you don't really notice because there's pretty long-lasting sessions with the ColdFusion administrator anyway. There's a bunch of other servlets. There's some that support Flash and a bunch of other things. There's JSPs. There's support for running actual JSPs, I should say. There's Flex integration. There's some graph support and other things. We can skip through this. So I guess we're going to have some final thoughts. Does anybody have any questions first?
This is the last slide.
OK, great.
So there's conclusions to take away. And in the paper, we actually have takeaways for different audiences. So we have takeaways for developers, takeaways for pen testers, and takeaways for Adobe in the white paper. But this is just kind of an overarching thing. So ColdFusion was designed to be easy, but the cost of making it easy is that it actually is very complicated underneath, and there are unexpected things that happen, like the variable scoping. Easy to make mistakes if you don't really understand how ColdFusion works with the request lifecycle, how error handling is happening, the default error pages and things like that, how variable scopes work, how the search order works. All these things, just by looking at the ColdFusion code, you have to understand how that works. Otherwise, you don't really know if there are vulnerabilities there. A lot of features in ColdFusion, quote-unquote features that are useful for debugging purposes, but open up holes because they increase the attack surface of the application. And those things should be minimized, just like in any other application that gets deployed to production. ColdFusion generated Java classes are pretty ugly. If you've ever looked at JSP compiled down to Java, it's similar. It's just like, it blows up, it explodes like 10 times the original size because of all the ugliness that happens there. And then if you come across a war or error or compiled class files in a server, when you're doing a pen test, you need to reverse engineer. Use our tool CFExplode to break them down into class files that you can then feed into JAD. And then just generally, there's a lot of stuff there when you deploy an application. If you take like a single page ColdFusion application and then you just use all the defaults and you say build a war, you'll get like a 120 meg war file that has all these servlet mappings and all the CF administrator and all these things turned on. So always strip out unnecessary components before deploying an application, and verify that they actually were stripped out before you put it out there. Here's our contact information. We have a blog, Veracode, where we sometimes write stuff. The white paper and presentation will be on the website, as well as probably the Black Hat website. The CFExplode tool is there on Google Code, and there's contact info for us if you want to ask anything afterwards.